Hey guys, it's Steve Duda. I wanted to take a minute to answer a few technical questions that I thought maybe would be useful information for all of you. So here's a few questions that have been submitted to the website. One of the first ones by Big Monkey. Big Monkey says that he wanted some advice from me on layering synths. He says, two things I've run across, and I know what he means by an anthemic synth riff now, is how to get that sound. The layering is the toughest bit. Well, Big Monkey, the trick usually there is to pick sounds which are complementing each other. I mean, it's a pretty kind of obvious thing to say, I guess, but generally, you start with a single sound and you have a certain thing and you feel like, oh, well, it's missing something. A lot of the time it's missing, it's an octave thing. Do you want it to have an octave up, or maybe a fifth up, or an octave and a fifth up, or an octave down? Some sort of trick with layering to do that kind of thing. When you're talking about riff layering now specifically, of course pad layering can be an entirely different can of worms where you get into more sound design, one sound fading down as another fades up and that kind of stuff. But when you're talking about layering synths for riffs, it's really comes down to like what you can't do with EQ or an effect, and really making sure that you generally in your ear you're like, oh, I feel like I wish this had an octave down on it or an octave up or something like that. Of course, when you start with most synthesizers, you have multiple oscillators, and sometimes you'll naturally do that where you just tune one oscillator up an octave or up a fifth or something to get a fuller sound. So there really are no rules, and ears, unfortunately, like with a lot of engineering things, ears come down to being the best tools, and people can argue about boosting a certain frequency on a certain type of sound, but it really means nothing when you don't know the source that you're starting with. So same kind of goes with layering synths. It's generally something that I don't really find is too necessary unless I hear that it is. And there's really two different ways to go. One is essentially it's all joining together into one sound though at the end of it. So you have to really keep that in mind, that it gets perceived as being one sound. So generally with layering, when it comes to riff sounds, the only time that I'll do it mentally separated is if I want, say, something that's noticeably a pluck followed by something that's more of a body. And that sort of layering, again, it still ends up being perceived as one sound in a sense, but then mentally I'm really separating it into the attack portion and then more of this body portion. And that allows you a little more flexibility than you could do with just, say, a filter envelope on a single static sound. So it's a difficult question to really answer succinctly, but there's a variety of things, and ultimately it just comes down to ears and kind of hopefully knowing what you're trying to go for, whether it's like the attack versus a body kind of approach, or whether it's versus like a octave sort of layering approach. So hope I answered that decently. Next question is from Marcus. Marcus said he wants to know what some of my favorite VST instruments are, and what plugins I use the most, and he said he's a fan of the Waves SSL. Well, Marcus, you might want to be aware of one plugin, which I don't use the Waves, but what I use is one that a friend of mine wrote, which I think is genius, which is called The Glue, and his company is called Cytomic. It's Cytomic. So you can go to cytomic.com and download the Glue demo. There's a lot of big producers that have done shootouts with that versus the Waves SSL, and they say that his wins in terms of emulating the quad compressor that you find in the G-Series Waves. So I use the Glue religiously. I love it. It's a great plugin to use as a bus compressor. So I'll use that a lot for dynamics. It's great for using as a sidechain type compressor as well for keying an external source. And then in terms of other instruments, there's a variety of ones. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Nerve since I wrote it, and some of the other plugins that I've written as well. I mean, I honestly use them. Lucifer, which is a stutter and scratch effect that it's not officially on the market, but when people email me, I'll send them a link to a demo. And then I'll probably get it back officially for sale at some point. So there's Nerve on extrarecords.com, of course, which is a drum machine I spent a good portion of the last year holed up away working on. And I use that now for making beats religiously. It's just obviously making it. I know it inside and out. So there's that aspect. But there's things that it does that I find just workflow-wise, it's a lot faster than any other approach for me, at least. In terms of other instruments, in terms of general like synths, I really love the F-Expansion Synth Squad. My friend Andrew, who I mentioned with the Glue at Cytomic, Andrew actually did the DSP bulk of the DSP behind the Synth Squad by Fxpansion. So I love those a lot. Great for basses and pads and leads. So that's a really good one. And then, the list kind of goes on and on. There's, different things I like for different moments. I like the Korg Legacy Cell plugins a lot. It's pretty much the only thing that I'll use a dongle for. I think that they're great synths, and good presets, good programming on them as well. And they just tend to win when I compare them to a lot of the freeware and other synths out there, which I'll occasionally use freeware. I actually make all my music on PC just because of the sheer plethora of software that's available in the VST world and PC. It just can't be beaten. Can't really compare to the Mac. So that's something in my mind that PCs really have going for it, is just the sheer abundance of software, including freeware, that's available that's PC only. So hope that answers the question. If you had any specific category of plugin, want to narrow it down a bit, maybe I could mention some other things that I like in that category of plugin. And then here's a couple other questions from Tom S. He asks me for tips on usage of filters and perhaps some waveforms that I like better than others. Second part's a little difficult to answer, but I'll start here with the usage of filters. There's, in my mind, really, there's two main ways of using filtering. One is in a way of making things more clear, in other words, removing the things that are undesirable. So a good example would be if someone submitted a acoustic guitar part, but it just felt kind of like muddy in the mix and I couldn't hear it enough. I might just use a high-pass filter so that it's just getting rid completely of all of the low frequencies. So that's one example of using a filter, and I kind of consider that a static use of a filter, where you're not modulating or changing the cutoff frequency or anything like that. You're just setting it to a certain position and forgetting it. And then in terms of other uses of filters, I mean, boy, there's a bunch, but another sort of classic example would be for a break or a build, like I'm doing on the track we're working on. I'm running virtually all of the sounds into this bus. In other words, it's this audio track that is just set to monitor in, and everything else is routing to that track. And then I've slapped a filter on there that's a high-pass filter, and over the 16 bars of the break section, I'm just automating that filter cutoff to raise up. So as the track plays, the cutoff just goes higher and higher, and the sound just becomes thinner and thinner. So it's sort of it's a good alternate solution. Instead of fading something out volume-wise, you can thin it out. So perceptually, people perceive that as getting quieter, but they also notice that it's sort of getting smaller at the same time. So essentially, filters are great, and there's not really a lot to say besides use your ears and of course, learn how it affects different sounds. Once you've run every instrument you can imagine through a low pass, a band pass, a high pass at different frequencies, you start to get a feel for how this affects sounds in general. And then you'll know in certain times when you hear something in your head and you're like, oh, I wish this was a little more, and you imagine in a little way, and you'll go, oh, what I'm imagining is high passed or band passed or low passed. And so hopefully that answers that. There's a whole lot of times to use filters. And then in terms of waveforms that I like better than others, that's a really tough question as well. It's sort of like saying, if you were asking a symphonic composer if there's instruments he likes better than others, you prefer the flutes or the violins, and it's like, well, I like to use them all for certain moments and certain times. And again, it boils down to your ears. So you learn how a sine wave sounds, you learn how a square wave sounds, and a triangle, and a sawtooth, and those are really your main four waveform types that you come across on all these different synths and everything. So learning kind of how those sound can get you a long ways, and the amount of buzziness that you desire, and the amount, in other words, the harmonics of the sound can determine what kind of waveform you want. If you want something to be dubby and subby, then a sine wave or maybe a triangle is the way you're going to want to go. If you want something more raspy and buzzy and cutting, you're going to probably want to go with a sawtooth or a square. And then, beyond that, you can even get into the whole layering, where sometimes saw plus square can be a little more interesting than just either or. But it comes down to use, and then layering on top of that. There's times where you want to use a sawtooth as your bass, but you realize it's just not quite subby enough, so you're going to double that up and layer an octave down. You're going to put a triangle or a sawtooth below that, or I'm sorry, a triangle or sine wave below your sawtooth. That way you have this really full, fat sound. So learning how the waveforms sound by ear, and then learning, practicing with layering an octave above another and sort of experiment around, you can get a whole variety of sounds out. So doing that, and or just looking at preset patches of any of these sort of mini Moog type soft synths or anything, you can start to see what waveforms people are using to try to imitate different sounds, whether it's a flute or a violin or whatnot, and that'll help you form connotations in your mind of when to use which. So hopefully that answers the question. Waveforms can also, of course, be used as LFOs, and the ear's perception is entirely different when you're working with something at a slower frequency. But I think a lot of that's self-explanatory for just how it sounds to yourself. Hopefully, if you have any specific questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer or expand upon that. Okay, Tom S. also asks, his involvement with our project is awesome, thank you, and one comment he made on one of my submissions that the members liked was that it was muddy. Could you give advice for identifying and cleaning up a muddy sound? Yeah, this is a tough one, because when I'd say that, I'd have to go back and listen to that again. I think it was a bass part, but a lot of the time with dance music in particular, a muddy sound, going back to your question about waveforms, can be when something is really just sort of sinusoidal. So in other words, there may not be even anything wrong with the sound. It may be just sort of a subby sort of part, a dubby part. But it's really hard to make that work with dance music, at least the type that I'm creating, because you really need some harmonic richness. You really need these things that are happening up in the mid-range and the high end. If it's all just happening down in the low end, then there's no way that part's going to really come across in a club system, because what happens in clubs is they have these huge bass bins, just like sometimes literally a wall of subwoofers, and when you have a part that's doing something musically with notes and it's just down in the subs, it really has to, it has to really do that boldly, so you have to generally use a synthesizer for it or something that's really going to just nail those pitches and be really solid. And then secondarily, you really can't have other stuff going down in that low end at the same time. So if it's something where the part just survives on being in the low end, this means now we can't have a kick drum down there at the same time. And I like to put my kick drums on every downbeat for the most part. So when you have a big kick drum sound, it's sort of the classic thing people say in dance music is if you have a big kick, then you can't have a big bass sound. Or if you have a big bass sound, then you can't have a big kick. So generally, if you start listening to a lot of it, you'll notice that, not all the time, but most of the time, that's sort of the rule that's followed. You have a short, brighter, punchy kick that goes with a big, full bass part, or vice versa, a big, boomy kick drum with a very sort of buzzy, more high-endy, mid-rangey kind of bass part. So sort of an either-or, just to prevent this clash and this mud that builds up down there. So if I'm correct, I may be wrong, but if I'm correct, your part was a bass part and it was just sort of lacking this mid-range, which is where I really need the bass part to cut through, because the kick drum is going to be taking up a fair amount of the low end. So hopefully that answers your question there, and I guess you asked for advice on identifying and cleaning up a muddy sound. Yeah, the identification is really contextual. If it's a dance track and it's a bass part, then if it's only happening down in the low end, then that's sort of a muddy part. In general, other parts, muddy is typically referred to as a relative balance of your different frequencies. So if you have an EQ and you're sweeping different frequencies, or if you're looking at a spectrum analyzer of these frequencies, muddy tends to refer to stuff happening from 350 hertz down to 20 hertz. So just your low end of the spectrum. When stuff is dominating down there, so most of the activity is happening down in that range, people will refer to that as muddy most of the time. So the first sort of generic way that people will talk about cleaning up a muddy sound is just to start cutting that low mid-range. So you take an EQ and you cut out, say, centered around 250 or 300 hertz, and you just pull out some of that range, 6 dB or more, depending on how muddy it appears, and then see what you're left with. And then conversely, you could of course do the same thing in reverse, which is boost the high end, boost everything above 400 hertz, and boost maybe the lowest lows as well. So one way or the other, same thing, but really just notching out that low mid-range so that you're not getting that sort of mud building up down in the low frequencies. So that's what I was referring to, is just the low end, and I wouldn't even mention it if I felt there was enough things happening up in the high end where I could just do it myself and take an EQ and pull it out. But when it comes to actually tracking and recording things, if you feel like it's a muddy tone going in, you're not going to be able to save that later with just a little bit of EQ. You're probably going to want to find ways to get a brighter sound. And so if it's a bass, maybe picking it, maybe getting some grit in there with the pick against the string, maybe switching the pickups, maybe changing out the strings if the strings are old, maybe going DI instead of using an amp. There's a few different ways that, on a bass guitar you might be able to get a brighter sound out. Playing or picking more up towards the bottom of the fretboard, more, or switching where you're playing so that it's slightly brighter of a sound. But just finding ways to sort of try to bring those harmonics out of it so it's not just this low end kind of thing. Sometimes you want that, but a lot of the time that just makes it really hard for the sound to cut through in the mix, and that's when you'll find bass players going, turn me up, because on certain speaker systems, if it's really just this big sine wave, you're not going to hear it. So to get the sound to cut through, you need those harmonics. So hope that answers the question. And then I guess Tom S. has one more question here, which is, can I speak about Nerve for a couple minutes and perhaps my proudest or one of two features? You've seen a lot of YouTube comments and are very positive about the ease of use. Thanks, Tom, for asking about Nerve. There's youtube.com/xferrecords, XFER records, if anyone wants to check out those YouTube videos. But Nerve is something that I'm very proud of, just kind of the amount of time I've spent on it. There's a whole slew of things that I think are great, but people talking about its ease of use, definitely. I mean, I think overall the number one thing I'm happy about with it is the workflow. So it's something where once you've learned it, you can just drag sounds right into it, say off your Ableton Live browser or Logic or whatever program you use. You can drag samples right into the pads, then you can see the waveform right there without having to page and move around. You see the waveform, you can trim it if you have some dead space at the start. If you want the sound to be shorter, you can grab it without going around flipping pages or tweaking controls. And then simultaneously at the same time you can see the part, so you can step sequence in. If you want a 4-on-the-floor kick drum, you only have to draw the kick drum once, and you can shorten the pattern down to just be 4 steps long. And so now with this 4-step long part, we're hearing this kick drum over and over. So I like the workflow. I mean, I can get a beat going really rapidly in Nerve, where otherwise I'd be sort of jumping back and forth between some sort of rack sampler, soft sampler, and back into the MIDI arrange window, and back and forth. So it saves a lot of sort of back and forth and tedium for me. And then, auditioning, if I don't like that sample, I can just hit the arrow to go to the next and next and next really quick. So the workflow in general is really rapid for me. I'd say that's my number one thing I love about Nerve. The next thing I'd probably say is the sculptability of sounds. You've got these pre-calculated effects that I did all the DSP in, so I'm proud of that as well. They allow you to do things like re-synthesize the sound, so you can turn a sine wave into like a 909 kind of kick with just applying some bend and some, maybe a little bit of triangle or something to just make your sine wave a little less pure. But it's got all those pre-calculated effects. You can check it out yourself at xferrecords.com, download the demo and play with those pre-calc effects. So those are probably the two things. I mean, I could go off on tangents, but really the number one is what I come back to, the workflow. Everything's right there, sidechain compressor, flipping between different drum kits, mixing and matching patterns with just menu selection, and being able to sort of get beats and more importantly, maybe things you don't expect to have happen, happening really quickly. So I've been working hard on the next version. All updates will be free to Nerve, and the next version has the drag and drop where you can export out audio parts. So if you make a cool loop in Nerve, you can literally just drag it right out into your host sequencer's arrange window, and boom, it internally renders out like the loop file for you, or the MIDI score if you want the MIDI part. So yeah, I'm really pleased with Nerve. It's been selling well. The reviews in the music magazine's been good, and thanks for asking about it. And I guess that's all the questions. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to shoot them my way, and I'll answer you directly or maybe in another video follow-up.